It was a bright and sunny day in the heart of London. The busy streets were alive with the chatter of tourists and locals, all going about their usual routines. In the distance, the grand Buckingham Palace stood tall, its iconic gates glinting in the sunlight. People were gathered around, some taking photos of the beautiful building, while others waited eagerly for the changing of the guards. Among the crowd, a woman named Karen stood out. Karen was with her family, her husband, and two teenage children, enjoying a day of sightseeing. They had been walking around the area, visiting different landmarks, but when they came to Buckingham Palace, Karen's frustration started to rise. It was a hot summer day, and despite the lovely surroundings, she was already irritated. The crowds were larger than she expected, and the heat made her feel short-tempered. As they made their way closer to the front of the palace, Karen spotted the royal guard standing motionless in front of the gates. They were dressed in their iconic red uniforms and tall fur-lined bearskin hats. To most people, the royal guards were a symbol of British tradition and history, but to Karen, they looked nothing more than an unnecessary tourist attraction. She had seen them countless times before, but today, something about them irked her more than usual. "Why do they stand like that all day?" Karen muttered, mostly to herself, but loud enough for her family to hear. "What a waste of time. It's all just for show." Her voice was filled with impatience as she tapped her foot on the pavement, waiting for something, anything, to entertain her. Her family tried to ignore her grumbling. They had seen Karen in one of her moods before, and they knew it was best to let her be for a while. But Karen wasn't in the mood to be ignored. She was determined to make her day more interesting, even if it meant stirring up a bit of trouble. She looked around, and in a moment of pure mischief, she decided that she would interact with the royal guard. After all, they were just standing there doing nothing, weren't they? She couldn't help but feel that they were simply there to add to the tourist experience, and that no one really took them seriously. With a smirk on her face, Karen made up her mind. She was going to get closer and do something that would make her feel like she had control over the situation. She stepped forward, ignoring the small voice in her head that warned her it might not be a good idea. She was going to make her mark on this day, even if it was by doing something outrageous. As she approached the guard, her family remained back, sensing something was about to happen, but unsure of exactly what. Karen walked straight up to the guard who stood closest to her, an older man whose expression remained stoic and unwavering. He didn't even flinch as Karen came closer, his eyes fixed straight ahead, as was the custom for the royal guard. Karen, undeterred by his lack of reaction, continued her bold approach. She stretched her arm out and, with a smirk, grabbed hold of the tall bearskin hat perched on the guard's head. The guard didn't move, and neither did she. It all felt like a game, one she thought she was winning. "Hey, that hat looks ridiculous," she called out to the guard, still holding the fur hat in her hand. The man didn't respond. The crowd, which had been quietly observing, seemed to notice her actions. A few people gasped, while others began to take out their phones, ready to capture the moment. Karen's family stood off to the side, stunned into silence. At first, Karen felt a sense of power. Here she was, holding the royal guard's hat like it was nothing more than a costume piece, but her feeling of triumph was short-lived. Instead of taking the hat and walking away with it, Karen did something that would push the limits of respect for British tradition. With a sneer on her face, she raised her foot and, without a second thought, slammed it onto the bearskin hat. The audience gasped, and the sound of her heel thumping onto the fur echoed through the quiet street. For a brief moment, everything seemed to stand still. Karen, unaware of the consequences of her actions, let out a small laugh, thinking it was all just harmless fun. Her family stood frozen, their mouths slightly open in shock. They couldn't believe what they were witnessing. Her son, embarrassed and unsure of what to do, tugged at his mother's sleeve, urging her to stop. But Karen was too caught up in the moment. She stepped on the hat again, pressing harder this time, crushing the delicate fur beneath her shoe. Karen thought the crowd would cheer her on, but instead, a wave of discomfort swept through the onlookers. The royal guard remained still, his posture perfect, but those watching started to murmur among themselves. Karen's actions, though bold, were seen as disrespectful to the sacred duty the guards represented. Still, she didn't seem to notice or care. She was too wrapped up in her own sense of rebellious triumph. The few seconds of laughter and arrogance faded quickly. Karen's feet were still on the hat, but she began to feel the weight of her actions, though it didn't fully register yet. She had always liked being the center of attention, and now she had definitely gotten it. The guard, unbothered by Karen's antics, simply stood his ground. He had seen it all before. Tourists attempting to interact with the guards, making jokes or trying to provoke them. But this time was different. Karen had taken it too far. Little did she know, the repercussions of her actions were about to catch up to her in a way she had never imagined. As Karen stood there, still with her foot on the bearskin hat, the scene began to shift from one of casual fun to something much more serious. The crowd had started to murmur, and the atmosphere was charged with an unspoken tension. No one had expected this. While some people watched in stunned silence, others began to pull out their phones, recording the whole situation. Karen, completely unaware of how her actions were being perceived, looked around, expecting someone to applaud her boldness. Instead, the whispers grew louder. For a moment, it seemed like nothing would happen. The royal guard remained perfectly still, his face expressionless, as if he were a statue, despite the fact that Karen had just defiled the hat that was a symbol of British military tradition. The silence that hung in the air was heavy, broken only by the distant sounds of traffic and chatter from other tourists nearby. Then, from the corner of her eye, Karen noticed movement. A second guard appeared, walking briskly toward her. He was tall and sharp in his uniform, his expression stern but composed. He wasn't looking directly at Karen, but his eyes were scanning the scene. His uniform was nearly identical to the first guard's, but his posture and authority were undeniable. He stood out against the backdrop of the crowd, his presence commanding attention. Karen froze for a second, unsure of what to do. The second guard stopped beside the first one, who still hadn't moved an inch. For a split second, Karen thought maybe nothing would happen. But then, the guard who had just arrived spoke, his voice calm but carrying a clear tone of authority. "Ma'am," he said, addressing Karen directly. "That is a very serious mistake." Karen looked at him, still not fully understanding the weight of the situation. "It's just a hat," she said flippantly, her voice filled with defiance. "Why are you making such a big deal out of it? I was just having a little fun." The second guard didn't react to her words immediately. He simply stared at her, his eyes steady and unwavering, as though he was weighing the situation carefully. The first guard, who had been the victim of the hat's removal, remained silent, but his posture seemed to stiffen just slightly. It was clear now that Karen had gone too far. Karen's family, still standing off to the side, began to look uncomfortable. Her husband shot her a glance, a silent plea for her to stop. He could see the situation was quickly escalating, and the tension in the air was beginning to feel thicker than ever. Her children exchanged nervous glances, but neither of them spoke up. They knew their mother well enough to know that when she set her mind on something, it was difficult to stop her. The second guard stepped forward, positioning himself so that he was directly in front of Karen. His face remained neutral, but his presence alone made it clear that he wasn't going to let this incident slide. "You have disrespected the uniform and tradition of the Royal Guard," he said, his voice firm and composed, "and that is not something we take lightly." Karen scoffed at him, thinking he was exaggerating. "It's just a stupid ceremony. You all stand around like statues all day. What's the big deal?" The crowd was beginning to shift uneasily. Some people were starting to edge away, no longer wanting to be associated with what was clearly becoming an unpleasant scene. Others were whispering among themselves, wondering how this would all play out. But Karen, in her own world, continued to argue. "I didn't hurt anyone. It's just a hat," she repeated, this time with more force. "You're all just too uptight." At that moment, something shifted. The first guard, who had been silent up until now, finally spoke. His voice was low but carried a certain weight. "You don't understand the significance of what you've done to you," he asked, his tone calm, but with an edge of disappointment. "This hat is more than just a piece of clothing. It's a symbol of the centuries of tradition and service that we represent. It's not something to be treated lightly." Karen opened her mouth to respond, but the words caught in her throat. She hadn't expected this response, this level of seriousness. She had thought it was all a joke, a harmless act of rebellion. But the reality of the situation was now sinking in, and her confidence began to waver. The second guard, seeing that Karen had no intention of backing down, turned slightly and raised his hand. Within moments, 2 police officers appeared from the nearby crowd, their uniforms marking them clearly as authority figures. They walked toward the scene, their eyes scanning Karen and the situation unfolding. The air became even heavier with the arrival of the officers. People who had been watching the scene unfold now began to shift their attention toward the police, some of them whispering and pointing. Karen's defiance was beginning to fade as the full scope of what she had done became clear. She still didn't fully understand why this was such a big deal, but the presence of the guards and the police made it impossible for her to ignore the seriousness of her actions any longer. As the officers approached, one of them addressed Karen in a calm, no-nonsense voice. "Ma'am, we need you to come with us. You'll have to explain what just happened." For the first time, Karen felt a knot of unease settle in her stomach. She had thought she could get away with her little stunt, but now she realized that there were consequences that she hadn't even considered. The attention of the crowd, the firm presence of the guards, and now the police had made it clear this wasn't something she could brush off. Still, Karen wasn't ready to back down. She opened her mouth, ready to argue, but the stern looks from the guards and the approaching police made her pause. The situation had escalated far beyond what she had imagined, and now there was no going back. Karen stood there, her feet still planted firmly on the bearskin mat, but the reality of the situation was beginning to sink in. The crowd that had gathered around her earlier was now almost entirely still, with all eyes focused on her. She could feel the weight of their gaze, the tension in the air, but she was too proud to show any sign of regret. The police officers had arrived, and the situation had shifted from an annoying little stunt to something far more serious. The 2 officers were standing a few feet away now, arms crossed, waiting patiently. They didn't look angry, but they didn't look amused either. They were professionals, trained to handle situations just like this. It was clear that Karen was no longer in control of the situation. For the first time, she felt a bit of unease creep in. She had always been someone who prided herself on getting what she wanted, on pushing boundaries and seeing how far she could go before there would be consequences. But this time, she hadn't just pushed the boundaries, she had crossed them completely. The guard who had spoken earlier, the one who had come to stand in front of her, took a step forward. His eyes were still fixed on her, his expression serious but composed. He had been standing there, watching her every move, without saying a word, but now his posture suggested that he wasn't going to let her get away with this. "You've embarrassed yourself today," he said quietly, his voice carrying through the stillness. "What you've done is disrespectful, not just to us, but to the country we serve." Karen felt a twinge of guilt, but she quickly pushed it aside. She wasn't going to let this guard lecture her. She wasn't about to admit that she'd made a mistake, not in front of everyone. "I didn't mean any harm," she said quickly, trying to brush off the severity of her actions. "It was just a hat. I thought it was funny. No big deal." The officer closest to her, who had been watching silently, finally stepped forward. He didn't seem angry, but there was a sense of calm authority in his voice. "It's not just a hat, ma'am. It's a symbol of centuries of tradition. The Royal Guard doesn't just wear those uniforms for decoration. They represent the history of this nation, and that hat is a part of that. Karen's face flushed. She hadn't considered any of that. To her, it had been a harmless joke, something to make her feel in control of the moment. But now, with the guard and the police officers standing there, it didn't seem so funny anymore. In fact, it was starting to feel like a big mistake. The second officer, who had been standing slightly off to the side, spoke now. "We're going to need to take you down to the station, ma'am," he said firmly. "You've caused a disturbance here, and that's not something we can overlook." Karen's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected things to escalate this much. Her mind raced, trying to come up with a way out of the situation. She had acted impulsively, not thinking of the consequences, but now it was too late to take it back. Her husband, still standing off to the side with their children, had been watching the entire scene unfold. He had hoped that Karen would stop, that she would realize she had taken things too far. But now it was clear that she hadn't. The look of frustration and embarrassment on his face made it even harder for her to keep up her defiant front. "Karen," he called softly, taking a step forward. "This isn't worth it. Let's just leave." Karen could see the disappointment in his eyes, and for a moment she hesitated. But then her pride took over again. She wasn't going to back down now, not in front of all these people. "I'm not going anywhere," she snapped, her voice sharp. "I didn't do anything wrong. This is ridiculous." But the officers remained calm, their demeanor unshaken. The first officer gave her a look that said everything. He wasn't going to argue with her. He was simply going to do his job. "Ma'am, you're not in a position to argue," he said. "You're going to come with us. It's not a request." At this point, Karen realized she wasn't going to be able to talk her way out of this. The officers weren't intimidated by her attitude, and neither were the guards. The crowd around them was watching intently, some of them shaking their heads in disbelief at her behavior. Others were recording the entire incident on their phones. Karen could feel the weight of their judgment pressing down on her, and for the first time in a long while, she felt small. As the officers moved toward her, Karen felt a knot form in her stomach. She had always prided herself on being able to get away with things, to push boundaries and face no consequences. But today, that had all come crashing down. The reality of the situation was now impossible to ignore. "I didn't mean to cause any trouble," Karen said, her voice softer now. She looked at her family, who stood behind her, silently watching. She could see the disappointment on their faces, and for a brief moment, she realized that her actions had hurt more than just herself. The second officer, who had remained quiet until now, gave her a nod. "We understand, Mom. But the consequences are still there. You'll need to come with us." Karen opened her mouth to protest, but the words caught in her throat. She didn't have an argument left. Her usual confidence had vanished, replaced by a cold sense of dread. She was finally starting to understand just how far she had gone, and it was clear that there was no turning back. With a deep sigh, she stepped away from the bearskin hat, which was now lying crumpled on the ground. The moment of rebellion had passed, and she was left with the realization that her actions had consequences, consequences that she would have to face, whether she liked it or not. Karen's mind was racing as the officers gently but firmly guided her away from the scene. She could feel the eyes of the crowd following her every move. The people who had once been simply observing now seemed to be watching her with a sense of disbelief. Some of them had clearly lost interest, their attention returning to the palace or the surrounding sights, while others remained fixated on her, still recording the incident on their phones. As the police officers led her down the street toward the small police station nearby, Karen's heart pounded in her chest. She felt a mixture of humiliation and anger rising within her. How had things escalated so quickly? A part of her wanted to yell, to demand an explanation from the officers, but she knew it wouldn't help. Her usual confidence, the kind that helped her in difficult situations, was now completely gone. The weight of the situation was starting to sink in. Her husband, who had been standing nearby, was silent as he followed them. He was clearly upset, though he hadn't said a word. Karen could feel his frustration building as they walked. She could hear her children behind them, murmuring softly, probably trying to process what had just happened. She didn't need to look at their faces to know that they were embarrassed. They were no strangers to her outbursts, but this time, it was different. This time, she had taken things too far. As they reached the police station, the officers led her inside. It was a small building, the kind you wouldn't notice if you weren't looking for it. The police officers didn't waste any time. They ushered her to a chair in the waiting area, and then one of them, a younger man with a serious expression, told her to wait there. He disappeared into a room behind the desk, presumably to report the incident or perhaps speak to a superior. Karen sat in silence, her mind swirling with thoughts. She didn't know what was going to happen next, but she knew that this wasn't going to end easily. She had broken the law, disrespected a symbol of British tradition, and now she would have to face the consequences. Her husband sat next to her, his face tense. He hadn't spoken a word since they entered the station, and Karen didn't know how to start the conversation. She could feel the weight of his disappointment pressing down on her. She had always been the one to take charge, to make decisions, but this time, she had made a huge mistake. "Karen," he finally said, his voice low. "What were you thinking? Why would you do something like that?" His words stung more than she expected. She wanted to explain herself, to tell him that it had been a joke, that she hadn't meant any harm, but she couldn't find the words. She had acted impulsively, and now there was no way to take it back. "I don't know," she muttered, looking down at the floor. She could hear the frustration in her own voice, but she didn't know how to fix it. I didn't think it would go this far." Her husband sighed and leaned back in his chair. "You never think things through, Karen. You just act on impulse and never consider the consequences." Her stomach tightened as she listened to him. He wasn't wrong, and it hurt to hear it. She had always been the type to jump into situations without thinking them through. It was one of her traits that had caused problems in the past, but she had never faced something like this. She had crossed a line, and now it felt like she had no way back. The silence between them was thick, the tension palpable. She could feel the weight of her actions bearing down on her, and it was difficult to ignore the shame that was creeping into her thoughts. She had never liked to admit when she was wrong, but right now it was impossible to pretend otherwise. After what felt like an eternity, the officer returned. He stood in front of her, his expression still neutral. He didn't seem angry, but there was no mistaking the seriousness in his tone. "Ma'am," he said, addressing Karen, "I need to inform you that you're being charged with disorderly conduct and disrespecting a member of the Royal Guard. You'll be given a fine, and you may be required to appear in court depending on how things proceed." The words hit Karen like a ton of bricks. A fine. Court. She hadn't expected this. The reality of what she had done was finally sinking in. She had thought she could get away with a harmless prank, but now it was clear that the consequences were real, and they were serious. Her husband turned to look at her, his face a mix of disbelief and disappointment. "Karen, I don't know what to say," he muttered. "This is bigger than you think." Karen opened her mouth to respond, but the words didn't come. What could she say? What excuse could she give for her actions? She had disrespected not just the guard, but the traditions and values that people held dear. And now she was going to have to face the music. The officer continued, his tone softer, but no less firm. "You have the right to contest the fine in court, but I suggest you take this seriously. This is an offense that won't be taken lightly." Karen nodded absently, her mind still reeling. She wasn't sure what she expected, maybe just a warning or a slap on the wrist. But this was far more serious than she had ever imagined. The officer left, leaving Karen and her family alone in the small waiting room. Karen sat in silence, her thoughts scattered. The reality of the situation was hitting her hard. She had made a mistake, a big one, and now she had to live with the consequences. Her husband didn't say anything else. He just sat next to her, the weight of the situation hanging over both of them. Karen couldn't help but feel like she had let everyone down, not just her family, but herself. She had always been the one to stand up and make a statement. But this time, her statement had been one of disrespect, and it had cost her. As they sat there, Karen realized that she had a long way to go before she could fix the mess she had made. She had learned a hard lesson today, one that she wouldn't soon forget. The hours that followed felt like an eternity to Karen. After the officer had informed her of the charges, she sat in the small waiting room, her mind a whirlwind of thoughts. The silence in the room was almost suffocating, only broken by the occasional shuffle of footsteps from outside. The reality of what she had done was finally sinking in, and she could feel the weight of her actions bearing down on her. Her husband sat beside her, silent but still tense. Karen couldn't look him in the eye. Every time she did, she saw the disappointment etched on his face, and it made her stomach twist with guilt. Her children, usually full of energy and curiosity, had fallen quiet, their faces serious and subdued. It was as if they were all processing the situation, trying to make sense of what had happened. Karen knew she had made a mistake, but the more she thought about it, the more frustrated she became with herself. How could she have let her emotions get the best of her? Why had she done something so impulsive? It wasn't like her to act without thinking, but for some reason, in that moment, she had thrown caution to the wind. She looked around the small, sterile room, hoping for some distraction, anything to take her mind off the events that had unfolded earlier. But there was nothing. Just the bare walls, a small desk with a few papers scattered on it, and the quiet hum of the fluorescent lights above. Karen longed to escape from the suffocating atmosphere, but there was nowhere to run. She had to face the consequences of her actions. Her husband, still deep in thought, finally spoke, breaking the silence. "Karen, you've got to understand. This isn't just about you anymore. You've embarrassed yourself, but you've also embarrassed us. And I think you need to really think about what that means." Karen's heart sank as she listened to his words. He wasn't angry, not really. He was just disappointed, and that hurt more than anything. She had always prided herself on being the strong one, the one who took charge of situations. But now she felt small, insignificant, and utterly out of control. "I know," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I didn't think it through. I thought it was just a stupid prank. I didn't mean for it to turn into something like this." Her husband exhaled sharply. "But that's the problem, Karen. You never think things through. You act impulsively, and now look where we are." He paused, then added, "We're in a situation we can't just walk away from. You've got to face the reality of what you did." His words stung, but Karen knew he was right. She had been reckless, and now there were consequences. There was no getting out of this. She had crossed a line, and it wasn't just about the fine or the court appearance. It was about how she had lost control and shown disrespect for something she didn't fully understand. Karen thought back to the moment when she had grabbed the guard's hat, when she had stepped on it with a sense of defiance, expecting nothing more than a laugh, or maybe a few raised eyebrows. But instead, she had received an angry response. The consequences had come much faster than she anticipated, and now she had to live with them. Her mind wandered to the guard, the one she had mocked. She hadn't meant any harm, but now, looking back, she realized how disrespectful her actions had been. The guard wasn't just standing there for show. He represented something far more significant. She had taken something that was important to others and treated it as if it were meaningless, and in doing so, she had hurt people she didn't even know. Karen's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the door opening. A man walked in, dressed in a uniform, his face calm but serious. He was an officer, one of the higher-ups, Karen assumed. He didn't look at her immediately, but instead glanced over at her husband and children, giving them a nod before turning his attention to Karen. "Miss Karen," he said, his tone neutral, "I'm Officer Thompson. I've been briefed on the situation. I just need to ask you a few more questions before we proceed." Karen nodded, her stomach turning. She had hoped the situation would just go away, but it was clear now that this was serious. There was no avoiding the consequences anymore. She had to face them head-on. Officer Thompson sat across from her, his eyes studying her carefully. He didn't seem angry, but there was a professionalism in his demeanor that made Karen feel even more nervous. He didn't waste any time. "You understand that what you did today was a breach of public order, correct? It wasn't just a matter of disrespecting the uniform. It was an act of defiance in a public space." Karen nodded, her throat dry. "I know. I didn't think it would escalate like this. It was just meant to be a joke." Officer Thompson paused for a moment, his gaze steady. "You may have thought it was harmless, but to others, it was an attack on something that holds great significance. The Royal Guard isn't just a tourist attraction. It's a representation of the country's history and values, and your actions undermine that." Karen swallowed hard, feeling a wave of shame wash over her. She hadn't understood the depth of the tradition and respect the Guards commanded. Now she realized how thoughtless her actions had been. It wasn't just a hat. It was a symbol of pride for so many people, and she had trampled on it without giving it a second thought. "I didn't mean to hurt anyone," she said quietly. "I just didn't understand." The officer nodded, acknowledging her words. "That's part of the problem. You didn't stop to think about the consequences before acting. Now we're here, and you have to deal with what comes next." Karen sat in silence, her mind spinning. She had never felt so helpless, so out of control. The reality of the situation was now undeniable, and the weight of her mistake was starting to feel unbearable. She had a lot to learn, and she knew that. But the hardest part was yet to come, the consequences she would have to face for her impulsive decision. The following days felt like an endless blur to Karen. After leaving the police station, she had been given the news that her actions would result in a fine, and there was a possibility she might need to appear in court. Her husband had remained quiet most of the way home, and the kids didn't say much either. It was as though everyone had fallen into a heavy silence that wouldn't let go. Karen spent the next few days in a constant state of unease, her mind never fully able to rest. The consequences of her actions were weighing on her, and she couldn't seem to shake the feeling that something had shifted. It wasn't just about the fine anymore. It was about something deeper, something she hadn't fully understood when she first acted impulsively. The entire situation had embarrassed her, yes, but what troubled her more was how it had impacted her family. Her husband, who had been so disappointed in her, barely spoke to her over the following days. Karen felt the distance between them growing, and it made her more anxious than the fine ever had. She had always prided herself on being able to solve problems, to make things right. But now she wasn't sure how to fix this. No amount of apologies or explanations seemed to reach him, and her children, normally so willing to forgive, had grown distant too, their once carefree nature replaced by an almost cautious formality whenever they were around her. Karen found herself replaying the events over and over in her mind. She thought about how she had mocked the guard's uniform, how she had taken the bearskin hat and stomped on it. She thought about the reactions of the crowd, the disappointed look on her husband's face, and the stern words from the officers. She had thought she could make a bold statement, but instead, she had made a huge mistake. One evening, as Karen sat alone in the living room, her mind wandered back to that moment outside Buckingham Palace, the moment when she had made the choice to grab the hat. She had done it impulsively, without thinking. But now she understood the weight of her actions. The Royal Guard wasn't just standing there for show. They represented something far greater than herself: history, tradition, and respect. What she had done wasn't just an innocent joke. It had been an insult, one that she had failed to recognize at the time. Her thoughts were interrupted when her husband walked into the room. He didn't say anything at first, but his presence alone made Karen feel uncomfortable. She could sense the distance between them, the things left unsaid. Finally, he spoke. "Karen," he began quietly, "I've been thinking a lot about what happened, and I think it's time we talked." Karen's heart sank. She knew this conversation was coming. She had hoped it would be easier, that things would resolve themselves over time. But deep down, she knew it wouldn't be that simple. She had hurt him, and now she had to face that reality. "I know I messed up," Karen said, her voice soft and regretful. "I didn't think before I acted, and I hurt not just the guards, but you and the kids too. I'm sorry." Her husband nodded, but there was still a long pause before he spoke again. "It's not just about what happened with the guards, Karen. It's about you always acting without thinking, without considering the impact your actions might have on others. This isn't the first time something like this has happened. You've done things that have embarrassed us before, but this was different." Karen could feel the sting of his words, but she knew he was right. She had a habit of acting impulsively, of seeking attention or making bold gestures without considering the consequences. She had been so caught up in her own world that she had failed to see how her actions affected the people around her. "I never meant to hurt anyone," she said, her voice breaking slightly. I don't know why I did it. It seemed like a funny idea at the time, but now I see how wrong I was." Her husband's expression softened, though he still looked disappointed. "I don't know if this is something you can just fix with an apology, Karen. You need to show all of us, that you understand why this was wrong, that you're willing to change, to think before you act." The weight of his words hit Karen hard. She had always been the one to make decisions quickly, to act on impulse. But now she realized that this approach wasn't just hurting her, it was hurting the people she loved the most. "I understand," Karen whispered. "I promise. I'll do better. I'll think before I act." Her husband nodded but didn't say anything else. The silence that followed felt heavy, as though both of them knew that the road to rebuilding trust would be long and difficult. But at least they were talking. At least Karen was beginning to understand the seriousness of her actions. The next few days were filled with a quiet tension. Karen worked hard to show her family that she was committed to changing, to being more thoughtful in her actions. She spent more time with her children, listening to them, and trying to understand their feelings. She apologized to them, not just for what had happened at Buckingham Palace, but for the time she had acted without thinking in the past. Her husband, while still cautious, began to warm to the idea of forgiveness. He knew it would take time, but he also knew that Karen was genuinely trying to make things right. Slowly, they began to rebuild the trust that had been broken, one small step at a time. In the meantime, Karen's thoughts returned again and again to the royal guard. She felt a deep sense of regret for disrespecting something so important. She had learned a valuable lesson, one that went beyond just apologizing for a bad decision. It was about recognizing the importance of traditions and respect, about understanding the weight of her actions before she made them. She knew she had a long way to go before she could fully make amends for what she had done, but she was committed to the journey. And while she could never erase the past, she hoped that, over time, she could show her family and herself that she was capable of change. As the days passed, Karen found herself reflecting more and more on the events that had led her to this point. She had never really considered the long-term consequences of her actions before, but now, after everything that had happened, she couldn't help but feel the weight of her choices. She had acted on impulse, never thinking about the bigger picture, and the ripple effect of that moment was still unfolding. Her relationship with her husband, though not broken, was definitely strained. He had begun to open up more, but there was still a noticeable distance between them. They had talked, yes, but it wasn't the same as it had been before. It felt like something had shifted, like the carefree conversations and easygoing moments had been replaced with cautious words and lingering silences. Karen knew that rebuilding their connection would take time and effort, efforts that she was more than willing to make, but she also understood that it wasn't going to happen overnight. Her children, on the other hand, had been quieter than usual. They weren't angry, but they were definitely more reserved. Karen couldn't blame them. She had embarrassed them, and that hurt more than she was willing to admit. She had always prided herself on being a strong, confident mother, the one who set an example for her kids. But now, she realized that she hadn't been the role model they needed, and that realization stung deeply. One afternoon, after a particularly silent breakfast, Karen decided that it was time to take a step in the right direction. She needed to show her family, not just through words, but through actions, that she understood the seriousness of what had happened and was committed to changing. She couldn't undo the past, but she could certainly make a conscious effort to move forward in a better way. She had an idea, a simple one, but one that felt important. It was time to take a trip together, to reconnect, away from the heaviness of recent events. It wouldn't be anything extravagant, just a quiet weekend getaway to a nearby town that they had always enjoyed visiting. Karen had always believed in the power of a fresh perspective, and she hoped this would help heal the wounds that had been left by her actions. As she sat down with her husband and children, she shared the idea. "I think we could all use a change of pace," she said, her voice soft but hopeful. "What do you think about going away for the weekend? Just the four of us. I think we could really use some time together, without all the stress of everything that's been going on." Her husband looked at her for a long moment before finally nodding. He was still cautious, but Karen could see the weariness in his eyes. He wanted to believe that things could get better, that they could move past the tension. Her children looked up at her, hesitant at first, but then her daughter spoke, a small smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "I think it sounds nice, Mom," she said. Her son nodded as well, though his expression remained neutral. Karen felt a sense of relief wash over her. It wasn't a guarantee that everything would be fixed, but it was a step in the right direction. The weekend away was a chance for them to reset, to spend time together without the weight of past mistakes hanging over them. It was also an opportunity for her to prove to them that she could make better choices, that she could be more thoughtful, more present in their lives. The weekend came quickly, and as they arrived at the small town, the sense of peace that had been missing from Karen's life for days started to return. The town was quiet, nestled between rolling hills, with charming streets lined with small shops and cafes. It was the perfect place to escape from the stress and tension that had followed her every step. As they walked through the town, Karen could feel the connection between her and her family slowly rebuilding. The tension that had been so palpable just days ago was beginning to dissipate, replaced by easy conversation and shared laughter. It was clear that, while the wounds from her actions weren't fully healed, the time away was doing wonders for their relationship. It wasn't an immediate fix, but it was progress. That evening, as they sat down for dinner at a local restaurant, Karen found herself feeling more relaxed than she had in weeks. The weight on her shoulders, though still present, was lighter than it had been. She had taken a step toward healing, and it felt good to know that her family was there with her, even if they still had a long way to go. Later that night, after the kids had gone to bed, Karen and her husband sat outside on the small patio of their rented cabin. The night air was cool, and the stars above were brilliant against the dark sky. It was a peaceful moment, and for the first time in a while, Karen felt like things could be okay. "I've been thinking a lot about everything," Karen said, breaking the silence, "about what happened and how I've handled things in the past. I know I've made mistakes, but I want you to know that I'm trying to change. I don't want to keep making the same mistakes. I want to be better for you and the kids." Her husband looked at her, his expression softening. "I know you're trying, Karen, and I can see that. It's going to take time. Trust takes time, but I'm willing to work through it with you." Karen nodded, understanding the weight of his words. It wasn't going to be easy, but she was ready to put in the effort. She was ready to be a better wife, a better mother, and a better person. And in that moment, surrounded by the quiet of the night and the gentle breeze, she realized that the first step toward change had already begun. It wasn't about erasing the past. It was about building a future where they could all move forward together. The next few weeks passed by in a blur of small, steady steps. Karen had returned from their weekend getaway with a sense of calm, but also with a determination to keep improving. The time spent away had given her the space to think about everything, about her impulsiveness, about the consequences of her actions, and about the future she wanted to build for herself and her family. The first thing she had done was sit down with her children, one-on-one. She wanted to make sure they understood how much they meant to her, and she wanted to apologize again for her actions. It was a difficult conversation, but one that needed to be had. Her son, who had been quiet about the whole thing, finally spoke up. "It was just embarrassing, Mom," he said, his voice low. "You didn't think about what you were doing, and it was really awkward." Her daughter, always a bit more open, hugged her tightly and said, "I know you didn't mean to hurt anyone, but sometimes you do stuff without thinking. It's just not cool." Karen felt her heart ache as she listened, but she also knew that hearing their honest feelings was important. They weren't angry with her, but they were hurt, and that was something she couldn't ignore. Karen had promised them that she would be more careful moving forward. She explained that she was learning how to think before acting, and that she was committed to being a better mother, one who understood the value of respect and careful thought. Her children nodded, though their expressions were still a bit uncertain. They wanted to believe her, but Karen understood that trust wasn't something that could be restored overnight. At home, her relationship with her husband was slowly beginning to heal. The tension had started to lift, but there was still some distance between them. They had resumed normal routines, but there were fewer casual conversations, fewer moments of easy laughter. Karen felt the weight of this, knowing that it was going to take more than just a weekend getaway to fully rebuild what had been strained. She continued to put in the effort, though, and little by little, her husband started to open up again. They began having more conversations about their future, about the things that they both wanted to achieve, and about the things they needed to work on. There were still some awkward silences, still moments when Karen felt like she was walking on eggshells, but the foundation was being laid for something stronger. One evening, after a particularly busy day, Karen and her husband sat down together after the kids had gone to bed. They were both exhausted, but there was a peacefulness in the air that hadn't been there before. Her husband spoke first, his tone quieter than usual. "I've been thinking a lot about everything, Karen, about how you've been trying, how you're really making an effort, and I think I'm ready to try again too." Karen felt a warmth spread through her chest as she looked at him. She could see the sincerity in his eyes, the willingness to forgive and move forward. It wasn't easy, and she knew that there would be more difficult conversations ahead, but she also knew that they were both committed to making it work. "Thank you," she whispered. "I know I've let you down, and I'm really sorry for that. I'm just trying to learn from this and do better." He nodded, his expression softening. "I know you are, and I'm proud of you for taking responsibility. It's not always easy, but it's the right thing to do. And we'll get through this, Karen. We'll be okay." Karen smiled, feeling a sense of relief wash over her. The road ahead wasn't going to be perfect, but they had both made the decision to move forward, to heal, and to grow together. That was all she could ask for. Over the next few months, things began to fall back into place. Karen continued to be more mindful of her actions, thinking before she spoke or made decisions. She had started a journal to help her process her thoughts and emotions, a way for her to work through things before they reached a boiling point. She also made it a priority to spend more quality time with her family, time that was free of distractions, where they could just enjoy each other's company without the weight of past mistakes hanging over them. Her relationship with her children improved as well. They saw the change in her, and they appreciated it. Karen had begun to understand the importance of being present with them, of being the kind of mother who was emotionally available and supportive. There were still moments when they disagreed, when they pushed each other's buttons, but they were learning how to communicate better, to listen to each other with more empathy. One evening, as Karen tucked her son into bed, he looked up at her and said, "I think you're doing a lot better, Mom. You're not acting like you used to. You're really trying, and I can tell." Karen felt a lump form in her throat at his words. It wasn't just an apology or a promise. It was a recognition that she was changing, that her family could see the effort she was making. It was all the validation she needed. "I'm trying, sweetheart," she said softly, brushing his hair back. "And I'll keep trying. Because you and your sister and your dad are worth it." Her son smiled, pulling her into a hug. "I know, Mom. We can see it. I think we're going to be okay." As Karen closed the door and walked down the hallway, she felt a deep sense of peace settle over her. She had learned so much from this experience, not just about herself, but about her family, about trust, and about the importance of thinking before acting. She knew that there would be more challenges ahead, but she also knew that she was ready to face them, not alone, but with the support and love of the people who mattered most to her. And that, she realized, was the most important thing of all.